The goblet trembled almost imperceptibly in Eloise Ashford's hands as she crossed the grand ballroom, each step an eternity of silent terror. The crystal contained red wine from the kingdom's finest vintage, but it also carried something infinitely darker. 3 drops of concentrated belladonna, enough to stop the heart of the nation's most powerful man within minutes. Around her, the nobility danced and laughed, oblivious to the fact that they were witnessing not a celebration, but the prelude to an assassination. The dark blue silk dress that Eloise wore had been carefully chosen by the Regent Council, a color that made her appear as just another lady's companion among so many others, invisible enough to approach the crown prince without arousing suspicion. But Eloise felt the weight of that dress as if it were chains, and the weight of the goblet, as if she carried not poison, but her own condemned soul. This was the night when everything would end, one way or another. I am so happy that you are here with me today, diving into this story of love, sacrifice, and redemption that unfolds in the gleaming and shadowy corridors of a royal court. If you love historical romances full of emotion and breathtaking twists, subscribe to the channel and leave your like to help me bring more stories like this to you. And now, let me take you back to the beginning of this impossible journey, so you can understand how a common young woman came to carry the fate of a kingdom in her trembling hands. Eloise Ashford was not born to be an assassin. She was born to be forgotten, erased from history like so many daughters of traitors before her. Her father, Lord Edmund Ashford, had been a respected advisor to the late king, a man of principles who made the fatal mistake of publicly questioning the ambitions of the Regent Council when the king fell ill. The accusation of treason had been swift, the trial a farce, and the execution even swifter. Eloise was only 15 years old when she saw her father's head roll on the scaffold, and her younger sister, Catherine, was only 8. That very night, men from the council came for them, not to execute them, which would have been a mercy compared to the fate that awaited them, but to offer them a dark bargain. Catherine would be spared, fed, sheltered, and educated in a distant convent, but only if Eloise became what they needed: eyes, ears, and, when necessary, a blade in the shadows of the court. For 5 years, Eloise served the men who destroyed her family. She learned to walk silently through corridors, to listen to conversations through closed doors, to decipher sealed letters, and return them to their places without leaving traces. She became a ghost, a presence so common in the chambers of nobility that no one truly noticed her anymore. And every month, a letter arrived from the convent, written in the childish and then increasingly mature handwriting of Catherine, proving that her sister still lived, still breathed, still had a chance at the life that Eloise would never have. Those letters were the chain that bound her, stronger than any threat or torture could be. The council knew this, and used that knowledge with cruel mastery. But this mission was different from all the others. 3 nights before the grand coronation ball, Lord Magistrate Cornelius Blackwood, the leader of the Regent Council, summoned Eloise to a private audience in his dark chambers that smelled of ancient parchment and rancid ambition. He wasted no time with preambles. Prince Alexander Dominic Thornwell, who in 5 days would turn 25 years old and finally assume the throne by his own right, had become a problem. In recent months, the young prince had begun asking inconvenient questions about the kingdom's finances, about contracts granted to council allies, about the sudden death of his father 6 years earlier. He was gathering his own loyal advisors, planning to dissolve the Regent Council as soon as he was crowned. He needed to be stopped before that could happen, and Eloise would be the weapon to stop him. Blackwood placed the small glass vial on the table between them, the liquid inside catching the candlelight like liquid ruby. 3 drops in the prince's wine during the midnight toast, and it would all be over. The kingdom would enter mourning. A younger and more malleable prince would be elevated to the throne, and the council would maintain its absolute control. And Catherine, her sweet Catherine, who was now 13 years old and dreamed of becoming a teacher, would remain safe and ignorant of all this. Or should Eloise refuse or fail, Catherine would be found hanged in her convent cell, one more tragic victim of melancholy and despair. The choice, Blackwood said with a smile that did not reach his empty eyes, was hers. Now, as Eloise moved through the glittering crowd with the poisoned goblet in her hands, She felt the weight of that impossible choice crushing her chest with each breath. The ballroom was a vision of opulence that would have taken her breath away under any other circumstances. Thousands of candles blazed in crystal chandeliers overhead, casting dancing shadows across marble floors polished to a mirror shine. Ladies in gowns of every imaginable color swirled past her like a garden of exotic flowers, their jewels catching the light with each movement, while gentlemen in their finest evening attire bowed and smiled with practiced grace. Musicians played from a raised gallery, their melody sweet and haunting, a counterpoint to the darkness that Eloise carried with her. She had attended dozens of such events over the past 5 years, always on the periphery, always watching, always invisible. But tonight she was meant to step from the shadows and into history, though no one would ever know her name or her role in what was to come. She had studied Prince Alexander from a distance for months, as she had been ordered to do. The Regent Council had painted him as a tyrant in waiting, a man corrupted by power and paranoia, someone who would destroy the stability they had carefully built. But what Eloise had observed contradicted everything they told her. She had watched him in the council chambers, where he listened more than he spoke, his dark eyes thoughtful and measuring. She had seen him in the palace gardens, where he walked alone in the early morning hours, his shoulders carrying a burden that seemed to age him beyond his 24 years. She had been present, hidden behind a screen, when he received petitions from common subjects, and she had witnessed something the council never mentioned, his compassion. A widow seeking justice for her murdered husband, a farmer whose lands had been seized by a corrupt magistrate, a merchant ruined by unfair taxes. To each of them, Alexander had listened with an intensity that suggested he truly cared, and to each he had promised investigation and, when possible, restitution. These observations had planted seeds of doubt in Eloise's heart, doubts that grew like thorny vines with each passing day. The man she watched bore no resemblance to the monster the council described. Instead, she saw someone isolated, surrounded by vipers who smiled to his face while plotting his destruction. She saw a man who had lost his father under mysterious circumstances and inherited a throne he could not yet claim, forced to watch as men like Blackwood wielded power in his name while undermining his every attempt at true governance. She saw in the rare unguarded moments when he thought himself alone, a deep and aching loneliness that mirrored her own. It was this recognition, this unwanted kinship with her intended victim, that made her hands shake now as she approached him. The palace bells began to toll, their deep resonance announcing that midnight approached. This was the signal. In moments, Prince Alexander would raise his goblet for the traditional toast to the kingdom's prosperity, and every person in the ballroom would raise theirs in response. Eloise's instructions were clear. She was to position herself near the prince, and at the precise moment when servants moved through the crowd refreshing glasses for the toast, she was to execute a practiced stumble, one that would allow her to swap the prince's goblet with the poisoned one she carried. In the chaos and excitement of the moment, no one would notice the exchange. The prince would drink, and within minutes he would collapse. The court physicians would be summoned, but it would be too late. Everything had been planned with meticulous precision, every contingency accounted for, every witness managed. Blackwood's network of spies and purchased loyalties ran deep throughout the palace. Even if someone suspected poison, the investigation would be controlled, directed away from the truth and toward whatever convenient scapegoat the council chose. Perhaps they would blame a foreign power, using the prince's death to justify a profitable war. Perhaps they would blame radical elements seeking to overthrow the monarchy entirely, allowing them to crack down on dissent with iron authority. It did not matter. What mattered was that Prince Alexander Dominic Thornwell would die tonight, and Eloise Ashford would be his executioner, and her sister would live, and this impossible nightmare that had been her life for 5 years would continue unchanged, stretching before her into an endless grey future of servitude and sin. Eloise had positioned herself carefully near one of the towering marble columns that supported the ballroom's vaulted ceiling, a location that gave her a clear view of the prince while keeping her partially obscured from the crowd. From here, she could see him clearly for the first time that evening, and the sight made her breath catch in her throat for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. Prince Alexander stood on the raised dais at the far end of the ballroom, surrounded by members of the Regent Council and various lords who competed for his attention, like carrion birds circling prey. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his military training evident in his bearing even in formal evening attire. His dark hair was swept back from a face that was more striking than handsome, all sharp angles and strong lines, with eyes so dark they appeared almost black in the candlelight. But it was not his appearance that arrested her attention. It was the expression on his face, or rather the careful absence of expression. He wore a mask of polite indifference as he nodded at whatever Lord Blackwood was saying to him. But Eloise had spent 5 years learning to read what people tried to hide, and she could see the truth beneath that mask. The prince was exhausted, not merely tired but soul-weary, and there was something else in his eyes when he thought no one was watching, a profound wariness, the look of a man who trusted no one because everyone had given him reason not to. As she watched, a young duchess approached the prince, her pink gown cut daringly low, her smile practiced and predatory. She placed her gloved hand on his arm with familiar ease, leaning close to whisper something in his ear. Alexander's response was perfectly courteous, perfectly correct, and utterly cold. He extracted himself from her touch with such subtle skill that she barely seemed to notice she had been dismissed. But Eloise saw it clearly. She had witnessed this same dance dozens of times over the past months. Women of rank threw themselves at the prince constantly, drawn by his power and position, their interest as transparent as glass. And every time, Alexander deflected their advances with the same frozen courtesy, never rude but never encouraging, maintaining a distance that no amount of flattery or beauty could breach. The rumors whispered that he was cold-hearted, that he cared for nothing but duty and power. But Eloise wondered if perhaps he simply refused to let anyone close enough to betray him, as so many already had. The palace bells tolled their final warning. 11 chimes had already rung out, their echoes fading into the high ceiling. One more remained, and then midnight would arrive, and with it the moment of her terrible choice. Servants in royal livery began moving through the crowd with silver trays, replacing empty or half-full goblets with fresh ones for the ceremonial toast. Eloise felt her muscles tense, her body preparing to execute the plan she had rehearsed 100 times in the privacy of her small room. 3 steps forward to position herself in the flow of traffic. A stumble, carefully choreographed to appear accidental. The swift exchange of goblets, her poisoned one for his innocent one, the movement hidden by her body and the press of the crowd. Then retreat back into invisibility while history unfolded without her. It was simple, elegant, and utterly foolproof. But something stopped her. Perhaps it was the memory of Prince Alexander, sitting alone in the palace library at dawn, reading reports of his people's suffering with lines of genuine concern etched across his forehead. Perhaps it was the recollection of how he had just last week overruled the council to pardon a young man accused of stealing bread for his starving family, his voice quiet but immovable as he declared that no one in his kingdom should face death for the crime of hunger. Perhaps it was simply that Eloise Ashford, who had been forced to become many things she despised, had not yet become someone who could murder an innocent man in cold blood, regardless of the cost to herself. The 12th bell began to toll, its deep voice rolling across the ballroom like the voice of fate itself. Prince Alexander raised his goblet high, and the entire assembly followed suit, hundreds of crystal glasses lifting toward the chandeliers in a glittering wave. Eloise moved forward, her body acting on instinct and training, pushing through the crowd toward the dais. She could see Lord Blackwood watching her from the corner, his eyes cold and expectant. She could feel the weight of 5 years of servitude and survival pressing down on her shoulders. And she could see with perfect clarity the moment when Prince Alexander's dark eyes found hers across the distance, locking onto her face with an intensity that froze her in place. In that instant, something passed between them, some wordless recognition that neither of them could name or explain. His eyes, so carefully guarded and empty when looking at everyone else, suddenly filled with something raw and undefended. It was as if he saw her, truly saw her, in a way that no one had in 5 long years. And in that moment of connection, Eloise Ashford made her choice. She moved with sudden, decisive speed, no longer following the careful plan that Blackwood had laid out for her. Instead of positioning herself to swap the goblets, Eloise pushed through the final cluster of nobles, separating her from the dais, her heart hammering so violently she thought it might shatter her ribs. The prince's toast had already begun, his deep voice carrying across the ballroom as he spoke words of prosperity and unity that rang with a sincerity the Regent Council could never replicate. The assembled nobles repeated his words in a chorus of voices, their goblets raised high, waiting for the moment when they would all drink together in symbolic harmony. But Eloise was no longer thinking about symbols or ceremonies or the careful choreography of assassination. She was thinking only of the terrible clarity that had struck her when Alexander's eyes met hers, the sudden absolute certainty that she could not and would not be the instrument of this good man's murder, regardless of what it cost her. Catherine would have to forgive her, or perhaps Catherine would never know, would live out her days in the convent, believing her sister had simply abandoned her. But Eloise could not do this thing. She would not. She reached the edge of the dais just as the prince lowered his goblet toward his lips, prepared to take the first sip that would signal everyone else to drink. In her mind, time seemed to slow to a crawl, each second stretching into an eternity of crystalline awareness. She could see everything with supernatural clarity. The way the candlelight caught the deep red of the wine in hundreds of glasses, the expectant faces of the nobles waiting for their prince to drink, the slight tightening around Alexander's eyes that suggested even this simple ceremonial act required effort from a man who trusted nothing and no one. She could see Lord Blackwood at the far side of the dais, his face a mask of anticipation, already savouring his victory. And she could see her own hand, still clutching the poisoned goblet, the crystal warm from her grip, the 3 drops of belladonna dissolved invisibly into the dark wine, waiting to stop a beating heart. Eloise did not pause to consider the consequences of what she was about to do. She did not think about Catherine, or about the 5 years of careful survival that had brought her to this moment, or about what the council would do to her when they realized she had betrayed them. She thought only of the man before her, a man she did not truly know but whose essential goodness she had witnessed in 100 stolen moments of observation. She thought of the kingdom that needed him, of the corruption he alone seemed willing and able to root out, of the justice he represented in a court drowning in self-interest and greed. And she thought, in the final instant before she acted, that perhaps some things were worth dying for, even for someone like her who had spent so long merely surviving. She stepped onto the dais itself, a breach of protocol so severe that gasps rippled through the nearest nobles. Her voice, unused to speaking loudly or drawing attention, cracked slightly as she called out to him, using his title as a shield against the intimacy of what she was about to do. The words tumbled from her lips in a desperate rush, informing him that his wine was poisoned, that he must not drink, that the goblet in her hand contained the proof of the plot against him. For a frozen moment, Alexander simply stared at her, his expression unreadable, and Eloise wondered if he would even believe her, or if he would dismiss her as mad, another attention-seeking woman trying to get close to him through dramatic means. But then she saw understanding dawn in his dark eyes, followed immediately by a calculation so swift it took her breath away. He was assessing the room, identifying threats, measuring distances and possibilities with the tactical mind of a man trained for command. His hand moved toward her, not to take the poisoned goblet but to stop her, and Eloise realized with horror that he intended to have the wine tested, to summon guards, to begin an investigation that would inevitably lead back to her and to Catherine. The council's web was too extensive, their reach too long. They would destroy everyone involved, her sister included, and find another way to eliminate Alexander within days. The only way to truly save him, to shock the system enough that he could seize control before they recovered, was to provide undeniable proof of the conspiracy. And there was only one way to do that. Before Alexander could speak, before the guards could respond, before anyone could stop her, Eloise Ashford raised the poisoned goblet to her own lips and drank deeply. The bitter taste of belladonna masked by the wine's sweetness as she swallowed her own death to save a prince who had done nothing but look at her with honest eyes. The ballroom erupted into chaos as the goblet fell from Eloise's nerveless fingers, shattering against the marble floor in a spray of crystal shards and poisoned wine. She felt her legs give way beneath her, the belladonna already racing through her bloodstream with terrifying speed, but before she could collapse completely, strong arms caught her, lifting her against a chest that was solid and warm. Through the growing haze clouding her vision, she realized with distant shock that Prince Alexander himself had caught her, that he was holding her with a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone so powerful, his face hovering above hers with an expression of such raw anguish that it pierced through even the fog of poison overtaking her mind. She tried to speak, to tell him about the council, about Blackwood, about everything she had witnessed and endured, but her tongue felt thick and foreign in her mouth, and all that emerged was a strangled gasp. The prince's voice cut through the rising clamor of panicked nobles like a blade, commanding and absolute, ordering his personal physician to be summoned immediately, demanding that his guards seal the ballroom and allow no one to leave, and finally, in a tone that brooked no argument whatsoever, announcing that he was taking the young woman to his private chambers where she would receive every possible care. The scandal of that declaration rippled through the assembled nobility like lightning through water. A prince did not carry strange women to his private chambers, did not touch them at all in public, and certainly did not abandon his own coronation celebration to personally attend to someone who appeared to be nothing more than a minor lady's companion. Lord Blackwood's voice rose above the din, smooth and concerned, suggesting that the guards could handle the unfortunate woman, that His Highness should not distress himself over what was clearly a case of excessive drink or perhaps a fit of hysteria. But Alexander ignored him completely, his arms tightening around Eloise as he turned toward the private corridor that led to the royal apartments, his long strides eating up the distance while courtiers scattered before him like leaves before a storm. Eloise felt each step as a distant, jarring sensation, her body growing heavier and colder with each passing second, her heart beginning to stutter in her chest with an irregularity that terrified her even through the gathering darkness. They reached his chambers in what felt like both an instant and an eternity, and Eloise found herself laid upon a bed so soft it felt like sinking into clouds. The room swam in and out of focus around her, all rich fabrics and dark wood, and the golden glow of firelight that seemed to pulse in rhythm with her failing heartbeat. Alexander's face remained above hers, his hand gripping hers with almost painful intensity, as if he could somehow anchor her to life through sheer force of will. She heard other voices now, urgent and professional, recognizing the clipped tones of the royal physician as he barked orders to assistants she could not see. Hands touched her, taking her pulse, opening her eyes to examine her pupils, pressing against her abdomen. Someone forced a bitter liquid down her throat, making her gag and convulse, and she heard the physician explaining in rapid detail that they needed to purge the poison from her system, that the next hours would determine whether she lived or died, that it would be a near thing regardless. Through it all, Alexander remained beside her, his presence a constant in the chaos of treatment and terror. At some point, propriety must have demanded that he leave, that he allow his physicians to work without royal observation, but if anyone made such a suggestion, he clearly refused it. Eloise felt his hand in hers through every agonizing moment, as the medicines meant to save her life racked her body with convulsions. She felt his touch on her forehead when fever took her, burning through her veins like liquid fire. And she heard his voice, low and urgent, speaking words she could not quite understand, but whose tone conveyed something that made no sense at all. Desperation, as if her life mattered to him personally, as if losing her would cost him something precious. The night stretched on in endless cycles of pain and brief respites, consciousness and merciful darkness. In her more lucid moments, Eloise tried again to speak, to warn him about the full extent of the conspiracy, to tell him about her sister who would now surely die because of her failure to complete her mission. But the words would not come, her body too busy fighting for survival to spare energy for speech. And always, through every moment of that impossible night, she felt Alexander's presence anchoring her, his will battling death itself for possession of her soul. It was only as dawn began to lighten the windows of his chamber, as the physician finally announced with cautious relief that the worst had passed and she would likely survive, that Eloise finally surrendered to exhaustion and slipped into a deep, dreamless sleep, her hands still clasped tightly in the prince's, neither of them willing or able to let go. Eloise woke to afternoon sunlight streaming through tall windows, draped in deep blue velvet, and for a long, disoriented moment, she had no idea where she was. Her body felt hollowed out, as if the poison had scoured away everything inside her and left only an empty shell behind. Every muscle ached with a deep, bone-weary exhaustion, and her throat burned as if she had swallowed hot coals. But she was alive, impossibly and inexplicably alive, breathing air that tasted sweeter than any she could remember. As her vision cleared and focus returned, she became aware of her surroundings with growing shock. This was not the small servant's room she had occupied for 5 years, with its narrow cot and single tiny window. This was a chamber of extraordinary luxury, all rich fabrics and polished wood, and the kind of quiet opulence that spoke of royal privilege. And beside her bed, slumped in a chair that looked wildly inadequate for his tall frame, Prince Alexander Dominic Thornwell sat sleeping, his dark head tilted at an angle that would surely leave his neck aching, his formal evening clothes rumpled and stained, his hand still resting near hers on the coverlet, as if even in sleep he could not quite bring himself to break their connection. The sight of him there, exhausted and disheveled and so very human, sent a wave of emotion through Eloise that was almost as overwhelming as the poison had been. He had stayed with her through the night. A prince who should have been celebrating his impending coronation, who had a kingdom to govern and appearances to maintain, had spent the dark hours sitting vigil beside a woman whose name he did not even know, a woman who had brought poison and chaos to his celebration. The realization brought tears to her eyes, hot and unexpected, sliding down her temples into her hair. She tried to move, to sit up, but her body refused to cooperate, responding with only the faintest tremor of her fingers. Even that small movement, however, was enough to wake Alexander, whose eyes snapped open with the instant alertness of a soldier trained to respond to the slightest threat. For a heartbeat, they simply stared at each other, and Eloise saw the transformation that came over his face as he registered that she was awake and conscious. Relief flooded his features with such naked intensity that it took her breath away, followed immediately by something more complex: concern, curiosity, and an anger that she realized was not directed at her, but at whoever had put her in this position. He leaned forward, his voice rough from exhaustion, as he asked if she could speak, if she was in pain, if she needed anything. The questions tumbled from him with an urgency that suggested he had been waiting hours to ask them, holding them back only because she had been too ill to answer. Eloise tried to respond, but her voice emerged as barely more than a whisper, cracked and raw, forcing him to lean even closer to hear her words. She told him everything. Perhaps it was the nearness of death that loosened her tongue, or perhaps it was simply that she had carried the weight of her secrets for so long that holding them for even one more moment felt impossible. She told him about her father's execution, about the council's bargain, about 5 years of spying and the terror of Catherine's life hanging in the balance. She told him about Lord Blackwood's order to poison him, about the lies they had told her regarding his character, about the months she had spent watching him from the shadows and seeing the truth they wanted to hide. Her voice broke repeatedly, forcing her to pause and gather strength. But Alexander never interrupted, never pulled away. Instead, he listened with an intensity that made her feel for the first time in 5 years that her words truly mattered, that she herself mattered as something more than a tool to be used and discarded. When she finally finished, her voice giving out entirely on the last words, Alexander sat back in his chair, his face transformed into something carved from stone, hard and utterly implacable. She watched emotions war across his features, rage at the council's manipulation, grief for what she had endured, and something else she could not quite name, something that looked almost like guilt, as if he blamed himself for not seeing the rot festering in his own court. He was silent for a long moment, his jaw working as he visibly fought for control, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but filled with a terrible promise. He told her that the Regent Council's reign ended today, that he would see every member arrested and tried for treason, that the conspiracy she had uncovered would be rooted out completely, no matter how deep it ran. And then, his voice softening in a way that made her heart skip, he told her that Catherine would be brought to the palace under royal protection within 3 days, that she would want for nothing, and that no harm would ever come to either of them again as long as he drew breath. It was a vow, solemn and binding, and Eloise understood in that moment that Prince Alexander Dominic Thornwell was a man who kept his promises, no matter the cost. The next 3 days passed in a blur of recovery and revolution. Eloise remained in the prince's private chambers, a fact that scandalized the entire court, but which Alexander refused to discuss or defend, simply stating that she was under his personal protection and that anyone who questioned his decision could take their concerns directly to him, an invitation that no one seemed eager to accept. Physicians attended her regularly, monitoring her recovery with the same care they would give to royalty itself, while servants brought meals of such quality and abundance that Eloise could barely comprehend it after years of eating whatever scraps were left from the nobles' tables. But the true drama unfolded beyond those chamber walls, in the throne room and council chambers, where Alexander, moving with the decisive speed of a man who had waited far too long to act, systematically dismantled the power structure that had controlled the kingdom for 6 years. Lord Blackwood was arrested before dawn on that first day, dragged from his bed by royal guards who had been personally selected by Alexander for their loyalty. The other council members followed within hours, their protests and claims of innocence falling on ears that had finally stopped listening to their lies. The evidence Eloise provided, combined with Alexander's own investigations conducted secretly over the past months, painted a damning picture of corruption that reached into every corner of the government. Treasury funds diverted to private accounts, contracts awarded to cronies regardless of qualification, petitions from suffering subjects ignored or buried, and most damning of all, documents suggesting that the late king's sudden illness had been neither sudden nor natural. Alexander moved through the revelations with cold fury, his anger all the more terrifying for how completely he controlled it, channeling it into methodical action rather than explosive rage. He appointed new advisors, men and women he had been quietly vetting for months, individuals whose loyalty was to the kingdom rather than to their own enrichment. He opened the treasury records to public scrutiny, exposing the theft that had impoverished his people while enriching the council. And he made it clear, in language that left no room for misunderstanding, that this kind of corruption would never again be tolerated in his kingdom, that he would rule with justice and transparency, or he would not rule at all. But even as the kingdom transformed around her, Eloise found herself struggling with a different kind of upheaval, one that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with the growing awareness of how Alexander looked at her. He visited her chamber every morning and evening, ostensibly to check on her recovery, but lingering far longer than medical necessity required. Their conversations started with practical matters, the details she could provide about the council's operations, the names of other servants who had been coerced as she had been, but inevitably drifted into something more personal. He asked about her childhood, about her father, about the years she had spent invisible in the palace corridors. And in return, perhaps because turnabout seemed only fair, she asked him about his own isolation, about the burden of inheriting a crown he could not wear while watching his kingdom be pillaged, about the loneliness that she had witnessed from afar but never truly understood until now. In those conversations, Eloise discovered something that both thrilled and terrified her. The cold, distant prince that the court saw was only a shell, armor worn against a world that had proven itself hostile at every turn. Beneath that protective distance was a man of deep feeling, passionate about justice, burning with a need to make amends for the suffering his forced inaction had allowed. He spoke of his father with grief that had never been permitted expression, of the suspicions about his death that he had harbored but lacked power to investigate. He spoke of the crushing weight of responsibility assumed too young, of being surrounded by vipers while lacking the authority to strike at them. And he spoke, with a vulnerability that made her chest ache, of the isolation that came from trusting no one, of going years without a single honest conversation, of forgetting what it felt like to be seen as something more than a crown waiting to be claimed. She understood, because she had lived her own version of that same isolation, invisible and alone even in the midst of a crowded court. And in that understanding, something shifted between them. Some barrier dissolved that neither of them had consciously maintained. On the third evening, as sunset painted his chambers in gold and crimson light, Alexander sat beside her bed as he had so many times before, but this time he reached out and took her hand with deliberate intent rather than medical concern. His dark eyes held hers as he spoke words that would have seemed impossible just days before. He told her that she had saved not just his life, but his soul, that her courage had given him the opening he needed to finally seize control of his kingdom, that he owed her a debt he could never fully repay. And then, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper, he told her that, debt aside, he found himself drawn to her in a way he had never experienced with anyone, that he wanted to know everything about her, that the thought of her leaving his chambers once she recovered filled him with a dread he could not rationally explain, but refused to ignore. Eloise's response died in her throat, tangled up with disbelief and a dangerous flutter of hope that she did not dare acknowledge. She was the daughter of a traitor, a woman who had spent 5 years as a spy and almost assassin, someone with no title, no fortune, no standing whatsoever in the rigid hierarchy of the court. And he was a prince about to be crowned king, a man who could have any woman in the kingdom, who would be expected to marry for alliance and political advantage, whose bride would need to be someone of impeccable lineage and spotless reputation. The distance between them was not merely vast but unbridgeable, or at least it should have been. Yet here he sat, holding her hand as if it was something precious, looking at her with eyes that saw not what she lacked but what she was, and waiting for her response with a patience that suggested he would sit there all night if necessary. She found her voice finally, rough and uncertain, and tried to explain all the reasons why what he was suggesting was impossible, why he needed to think about his kingdom and his duty and the scandal that would erupt if he showed favor to someone like her. Alexander listened to her objections with the same focused attention he gave everything, and when she finally ran out of words, he responded with a question that cut through all her careful arguments like a sword through silk. He asked if she felt nothing for him, if the hours they had spent talking had meant nothing to her, if she could honestly say that the connection growing between them was one-sided and unwelcome. The question hung in the air between them, demanding honesty, and Eloise found she could not give him the lie that would have been safer for them both. She admitted, her voice barely audible, that she had begun to care for him somewhere in the darkness of that first night when he had refused to leave her side, that every conversation since had only deepened feelings she had no right to harbor, that she thought about him constantly with a mixture of admiration and longing that terrified her because it could lead nowhere but heartbreak. She was nothing and he was everything, and caring for him changed none of the fundamental impossibilities that stood between them. His response was to lean forward and cup her face in his hands with a tenderness that made tears spring to her eyes. He told her that she was not nothing, that she was the bravest person he had ever known, that she had sacrificed herself to save a man she barely knew simply because it was right, and that kind of courage and integrity was worth more than all the noble bloodlines in the kingdom. He told her that he had spent his entire life surrounded by people of impeccable breeding and spotless reputation who would have let him die without a second thought if it served their interests, and that he would rather have one woman of true character than 1,000 well-born schemers. And then, with the kind of determination that had allowed him to dismantle the Regent Council in 3 days, he told her that he intended to court her properly, to give her time to recover and to know him outside the crisis that had thrown them together, and that if at the end of that courtship she still wanted him, he would find a way to make it work regardless of what tradition or expectation demanded. The declaration should have been romantic, and part of Eloise recognized it as such, but another part, the part that had survived 5 years in the shadows by being ruthlessly practical, understood the firestorm that such a courtship would ignite. The nobles would be scandalized, the foreign powers who hoped to secure alliances through marriage would be insulted, and the common people might well see it as proof that their new king valued his own desires above the kingdom's needs. She tried to voice these concerns, but Alexander silenced her with a look that was both gentle and immovable. He reminded her that he had just spent 6 years being controlled by others, having his every decision questioned and undermined, watching his kingdom suffer because he lacked the power to act. Now, finally, he had that power, and he would be damned if he would use it to make himself miserable by bowing to the same tired expectations that had allowed men like Blackwood to flourish. He would be a good king, a just king, but he would also be a man who chose his own path, and if the court did not like it, they were welcome to learn to live with disappointment. The conversation might have continued indefinitely, circling through objections and reassurances, but it was interrupted by a knock at the chamber door and the announcement that made Eloise's heart stop entirely. Catherine had arrived, brought to the palace under royal escort as Alexander had promised, and she was asking to see her sister. Eloise tried to rise from the bed, desperate to go to her sister immediately despite her lingering weakness, but Alexander was faster, his hands gentle but firm as he eased her back against the pillows. He told her to wait, that he would bring Catherine to her, and then he was gone, his long strides carrying him from the room before she could protest. She lay there in a state of almost unbearable anticipation, 5 years of separation about to end, terrified of what Catherine might think of her now, of how her sister might have changed, of whether the bond between them had survived the long silence and separation that the council had imposed. And then the door opened again, and a young woman entered, no longer the 8-year-old child Eloise remembered, but a girl on the cusp of womanhood, with the same dark curls and grey eyes that Eloise saw in her own mirror, and tears were already streaming down both their faces as Catherine crossed the room in a rush and threw herself into her sister's arms, both of them sobbing too hard for words. The reunion with Catherine filled the hollow places in Eloise's heart that 5 years of survival had carved out, and for the first time since her father's execution, she felt something close to whole. They talked for hours, making up for lost time, with Catherine describing her life at the convent, with an animation that suggested it had not been the prison Eloise had feared. The sisters there had been kind, Catherine explained, and had educated her well, teaching her literature and mathematics and languages that would have been denied to her in any other circumstance. She had friends. She had been happy in a quiet way, though she had missed her sister desperately and had spent countless nights praying for Eloise's safety. When Eloise tried to apologize for the years of separation, for the choice she had made to save Catherine's life at the cost of their being together, Catherine simply held her tighter and told her that she understood, that she had always understood, and that no apology was necessary for the sacrifice that had given her a chance at life. Alexander visited them several times during those first days, ostensibly to ensure both sisters had everything they needed, but Eloise noticed how Catherine watched him with sharp intelligence, her young eyes missing nothing about how the prince looked at her sister, or how Eloise's face softened whenever he entered the room. As Eloise's strength returned, and she was finally able to leave the bed that had been her world for days, Alexander made good on his promise to court her properly, though his version of proper courtship was unlike anything the traditional court would recognize. He walked with her through the private palace gardens in the early morning hours, when the world was still quiet and they could talk without being observed by 100 curious eyes. He brought her to his library, a sanctuary of leather-bound books and comfortable chairs, where he admitted he had spent most of his lonely childhood, and they read together in companionable silence that spoke of a comfort neither had known with anyone else. He introduced her to the new advisers he had appointed, making it clear through his actions, if not his words, that her opinions mattered to him, that he valued her insights, born from years of observation in the shadows. And slowly, carefully, he told her the story of his own past, the trauma that had shaped him into the guarded man he had become. His father's death had not been natural, as Eloise had suspected, but a slow poisoning orchestrated over months by the very council that was supposed to serve him. Alexander had been only 19, still too young to rule by law, and he had been forced to watch helplessly as his father deteriorated, knowing something was wrong but unable to prove it, surrounded by men who smiled and offered sympathy while they murdered the king. The experience had taught him to trust no one, to see threats in every gesture of friendship, to lock away his heart behind walls of ice, because vulnerability meant death. He had spent 6 years in that frozen state, going through the motions of life while waiting for the day he could finally seize power, and bring his father's murderers to justice. And then Eloise had appeared, offering him poisoned wine and her own life in the same gesture. And something in that act of desperate courage had shattered the walls he had built, letting light into places that had been dark for far too long. The confession broke something open in Eloise as well, helping her understand that the connection between them was not merely attraction or gratitude, but recognition. They were both survivors of the same corrupt system, both people who had been forced to hide their true selves to stay alive, both desperately lonely in ways that others could not comprehend. In finding each other, they had found someone who understood without explanation, who saw past the armor to the wounded soul beneath, and that understanding created a bond stronger than anything based purely on romance could be. She told him this one evening as they sat together in his study, the fire crackling softly, and the rest of the palace sleeping around them. And she watched his face transform with an emotion so powerful it made her breath catch. He told her then that he loved her, the words simple and direct, stripped of poetry, but all the more powerful for their honesty. He loved her courage, her resilience, her compassion that had survived years of impossible circumstances. He loved the way she saw through pretense to truth, the way she challenged him to be better, the way she made him feel alive for the first time in 6 years, and he wanted, if she would have him, to spend the rest of his life loving her. Eloise's response was to close the distance between them and kiss him, her first kiss and his first honest one, a meeting of lips that sealed a promise neither of them spoke aloud, but both understood completely. This was not a romance of convenience or political calculation. This was two broken people choosing to heal together, two lonely souls deciding that they were done being alone. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard and eyes bright, Alexander told her what he had been planning, the grand gesture that would make their relationship undeniably public and force the court to accept what they could not change. In 2 weeks, there would be a ball, a celebration to mark his formal coronation and the beginning of his true reign. And at that ball, before the assembled nobility of the kingdom and representatives from every major power in the region, he intended to publicly declare his intention to marry her, to make Eloise Ashford, daughter of a traitor and former spy, his chosen queen. The announcement would shock everyone, would scandalize the traditionalists and thrill the romantics, and would establish once and for all that King Alexander Dominic Thornwell ruled on his own terms, choosing love and character over politics and bloodlines. The night of the coronation ball arrived with all the pageantry and splendor that such an occasion demanded. But this time Eloise entered the grand ballroom not as an invisible servant carrying poison, but as a woman transformed, wearing a gown of deep sapphire silk that Alexander had commissioned for her, her dark hair arranged in an elaborate style that somehow made her feel both beautiful and terrified. Catherine stood beside her, serving as both sister and chaperone, squeezing her hand with encouraging warmth as they entered the same space where, just 2 weeks earlier, Eloise had been prepared to commit murder. The ballroom blazed with even more magnificence than before, as if the palace itself wanted to celebrate the true beginning of Alexander's reign. The nobles who had gathered turned to look as she entered, their faces reflecting confusion and curiosity as they tried to place this mysterious woman who clearly held some significance, but whose identity remained unknown to most. Whispers rippled through the crowd like wind through grass, speculation building with each passing moment, and Eloise felt her courage wavering under the weight of so many eyes until she found Alexander's gaze across the room, steady and certain, anchoring her as he had since that first terrible night. The evening proceeded with the formal coronation ceremony, a ritual of ancient words and symbolic gestures that transformed Prince Alexander into King Alexander, the crown settling on his dark hair like it had always belonged there, his bearing regal and commanding as he accepted the oaths of loyalty from his new council and the representatives of noble houses. But Eloise noticed what others might have missed, the way his eyes kept finding her in the crowd, the slight softening of his expression whenever their gazes met, the sense that for all the importance of the ceremony, his mind was focused on what came next. When the formal rituals concluded and the celebration began in earnest, Alexander did not immediately join the dancing or accept the congratulations being offered from all sides. Instead, He raised his hand for silence, his voice carrying across the ballroom with the authority of a man accustomed to being heard, and announced that he had a declaration to make, one that concerned not matters of state, but matters of the heart. The silence that fell was absolute, hundreds of people holding their breath in anticipation, and Eloise felt her heart hammering so violently she thought everyone must surely hear it. Alexander descended from the dais where he had been crowned and walked directly to her, his path through the crowd as decisive as everything else about him, and when he reached her, he took her hand in his and turned to face the assembled nobility with her at his side. And then, in words that would be repeated and debated for years to come, he told them the truth. He told them about the conspiracy to poison him, about the Regent Council's corruption, and about the woman who had saved his life by drinking poison meant for him, sacrificing herself for a man she barely knew simply because it was right. He told them that Eloise Ashford possessed more courage, integrity and honor than anyone he had ever known, that her character far exceeded the importance of noble bloodlines or political alliances, and that he had chosen her to be his queen, if she would accept him. The shock that rippled through the ballroom was almost physical, gasps and exclamations erupting from every corner as nobles processed this unprecedented announcement. A commoner as queen, a woman with no title or fortune, the daughter of an executed traitor elevated to the highest position in the land. It defied every tradition, violated every expectation, and yet here stood their newly crowned king, publicly claiming this woman before them all. His declaration both a question to her and a challenge to anyone who might object. Eloise felt tears streaming down her face as she looked up at Alexander, seeing in his eyes not just love but absolute certainty, a man who had made his choice and would not be swayed by scandal or tradition or political pressure. Her voice shook as she gave him the answer that everyone in that ballroom was waiting to hear, accepting his proposal with words that were simple but carried the weight of everything they had survived together. The king smiled then, a genuine expression of joy that transformed his usually serious face, and he kissed her there before the entire court, sealing their engagement with a gesture that was both deeply personal and undeniably public, claiming her as his own in a way that left no room for doubt or opposition. The celebration that followed was unlike anything Eloise could have imagined. Some nobles remained scandalized, their disapproval evident in pursed lips and stiff postures, but others, perhaps recognizing the futility of opposing their king's clearly stated will, began to offer congratulations with varying degrees of sincerity. But more importantly, Eloise saw something else in the faces of the servants who lined the walls, the guards who stood at attention, the common people who had been allowed into the outer halls to witness the coronation. She saw hope and validation, the powerful message that worth came from character rather than birth, that courage and integrity could elevate anyone, that their new king valued truth over tradition. In choosing her, Alexander had not merely followed his heart, but had made a statement about the kind of ruler he intended to be, one who rewarded merit over privilege, who saw value in unexpected places, and who refused to be bound by the same corrupt system that had allowed men like Blackwood to flourish. As the evening wore on, and she danced in Alexander's arms, surrounded by the glittering spectacle of the court, Eloise understood that her vindication was complete. She had entered this ballroom 2 weeks ago as someone invisible and powerless, marked for death whether she succeeded in her mission or failed. She left it as the future queen, loved by a good man, reunited with her sister, and validated before everyone who had ever overlooked or underestimated her. The girl who had been nothing had become everything, not through manipulation or scheming, but through the simple choice to do what was right even when it cost her everything. And so, dear listener, as I close this story of courage and love, of sacrifice and redemption, I want you to carry something with you into your own life. Eloise Ashford's journey reminds us that our worth is not determined by how others see us, by the circumstances of our birth or by the mistakes of our past. Your value lies in your character, in the choices you make when everything is on the line, in the courage to do right even when the cost seems unbearable. There will be times when you feel invisible, overlooked, trapped by circumstances beyond your control. But remember that every act of integrity, every moment of courage, every choice to stand for truth even when standing alone, These things matter more than all the worldly advantages others might possess. And remember too that love, real love, sees not what you lack but who you truly are, and that the right person will value your character over everything else. May you have the courage to drink your own poison when necessary, to sacrifice for what is right, and may you find someone who sees your worth and is willing to fight the world to honor it. Until our next story, hold fast to your integrity, believe in your own value, and never forget that the most powerful vindication comes not from proving others wrong, but from living so truly that your worth becomes undeniable.